Solak, his wife Kathy, Tom's brother David, who was killed aboard the Liberty, and posthumously awarded the Silver Star. Thank you, Tom. This little girl was riding in her mom's car on the way to school one day and stopped at a red light. She says, Mom, how old are you? And she said, hey, that's an impolite question to ask a lady. A few months later, stopped at another red light, and she says, Mama, how much do you weigh? She said, honey, that's a very personal question. That's something you just don't ask a lady. A couple red lights later, she said, Mama, why did your daddy get a divorce? She said, okay, that ends this conversation. That's enough. I don't know where you get this stuff from, but this conversation is at an end. Little girl gets to school, and her friend says, how did you make out? She said, not at all. When I asked her about the divorce, she got really, really angry. And her friend said, oh, that's easy. She said, when you get a chance, take a look at her driver's license. It's like a school report card. It's got all that stuff on there. A few days later, they're on the way to school. She says, Mama, yes, dear. I know how old you are. Oh. You're 27 years old. Oh. And I know how much you weigh. You weigh 117 pounds. And the reason you and Daddy got a divorce is because you got an F in sex at school. Report cards. Report cards are not just always what they seem. There was a report card that was written up on the attack on the USS Liberty. It was ordered by the President of the United States, executed under the authority of a gentleman by the name of McCain. Senator John McCain's father at the time was Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Forces in Europe. And a Vice Admiral by the name of Isaac Kidd. When the final report was produced, there was only 1 week that was given for testimony to be taken. The court was ordered to only investigate if there were any actions on the part of the crew which contributed to the horrible event that took place. Many of the testimonies were deleted from the record, from the final report card. There were 2 Navy Judge Advocate Generals that were ordered to look at the legal aspects of the case. One of them, his name was Merlin Starring. When he retired, he was Judge Advocate General of the Navy. If any of you remember seeing the JAG series on television some time ago, he was the guy with all the gold on his sleeve. At the time, he was a much younger rank than that. The other gentleman, name was Ward Boston. Ward Boston was counsel for Admiral Isaac Kidd, and Merlin Starring was legal counsel for Admiral John McCain's court. When the report was finally given to Merlin Starring, he determined that it was about a 300-page document. He started going through it. It took a considerable period of time. He sat in my living room some years ago and told me that there were some serious mistakes with the report as he was reading it. There were a lot of references to legal proceedings that were not properly referenced. There were just a bunch of mistakes. Ward Boston the next day came into Merlin Starring's office and said the Admiral wants the report right now. And Merlin Starring said to him, well, I've only gone through about a third of it, and it's loaded with errors that need to be corrected before the final draft. He left, and about 20 minutes later came back again and said, Admiral Kane wants the report right now. That was a report that was finally sent to the President. Every page of that report was supposed to have been initialed by both of the JAG officers, Merlin Starring and Ward Boston. Many of the pages in the final report did not carry those initials. Merlin Starring's final report, the signature was not his signature, and that was a report that was presented to the public. But let's back up a few years. The USS Liberty was originally a Victory-class freighter. She was produced by the Kaiser Motor Car Company in May of 1945. This was a new type of ocean freighter. The Nazis in World War II were knocking out our freighters at a terrific rate, and the gentleman that led the Kaiser Motor Car Company at the time said, I can produce a ship much larger and do it much faster. In fact, towards the tail end of the war, when the Liberty was actually launched, at the time she was the SS Simmons Victory merchant marine vessel. At the time she was launched, Kaiser Motor Car Company was producing one of these vessels a day. That was far faster than the Nazis could sink them. She saw service and shortly after World War II. She was placed in mothballs, taken back out of mothballs for the Korean conflict, put back in service for the Korean conflict, and shortly after the Korean War was placed back in mothballs. In 1964, the Navy was wanting to update their seaborne collection vessels. There was a series of 5 vessels that were placed in service with the most modern equipment of the day available. Good evening, Buddy. Good to see you, sir. Thank you for coming. 5 of these vessels were placed in service when Liberty was finally refurbished and placed back in service in 1965. The Navy had invested $26 million in refurbishing the ship, equipping her with the finest in electronic surveillance equipment that was available at the time. We had also had aboard her a UNIVAC computer, which at that time was the world's largest mobile computer. You can do that much with your watch now, but we're talking about 50 years ago back then. Her normal sailing was up and down the west coast of Africa. Several of the African countries had just won their independence from the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, and the English, and there was quite an influence in those colonies between the Cuban government and the Russian government to influence those countries. They were very rich in natural resources, gold, silver, rare metals, oils, minerals. So the Soviets were desired of influence there, strong influence there, as were the Cubans. And the U.S. government wanted to keep track of what was going on. I was actually in 1967 on a mission with VQ-2. It was an airborne intelligence collection outfit operating out of Spain. That mission dried up at the end of May of 1967. I was returned to my temporary base at Rota, Spain. During the night after Memorial Day, came a knock on my door in the middle of the night. There was a messenger there from the officer of the day shack. He said, Sergeant Lockwood? I said, yes. He said, we have a message here from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You are to join the USS Liberty at 0600 in the morning. Better get up and pack your sea bag. Well, I didn't have a sea bag. We had been traveling in civilian clothes. I don't know how Europeans could possibly miss 3 young Marines running around with flat-top haircuts. But anyway, that was what we were supposed to be doing, was in civilian clothes. I only had one dress uniform, which was khakis at the time, one work uniform, which was utilities at the time, and the rest of my equipment was all flight suits for VQ-2. I packed what little bit I had in my brand new Samsonite suitcase, and at 0600 hours there I was standing on the dock looking at this funny looking ship loaded with antennas all over the place, a lot of antennas I'd never seen before, I was used to working intelligence in the Marines. We had RC-292 antennas, and we had a couple of other short wire antennas they were designed just for short range communications intercept. Suddenly I'm looking at the very latest in electronics surveillance gear. There were 5 other gentlemen there with me. There were 3 civilians from National Security Agency there. A gentleman by the name of Alan Blue, Don, gosh, my mind's not working very well tonight, but and another gentleman from the Central Intelligence Agency, and 2 Marines from 2nd Radio Battalion in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. These 2 young Marines were both Arabic linguists. The 3 civilians were all Arabic linguists. We had on the after part of the ship towards the fantail a gigantic dish antenna. We did not have satellite communications back in those days. I think about 1963 or 64 was when the first satellite beamed television programs from the United States to Europe. But we did not have military communications via satellite at that time. What we did do was bounce radio transmissions with this dish antenna on the fantail of the ship off the moon. And those radio communications were picked up by a gigantic dish antenna located in Shelbyville, Maryland. Well, there's a problem. You got to keep that dish antenna aimed at the moon. And when you're at a ship at sea, this thing is going to pitch, roll, and buck. So a hydraulic system was designed to keep that dish aimed at the moon. Well, the hydraulic connections were not just wonderfully designed. And every time the ship would pitch and roll, hydraulic fluid would squirt from those joints all over the after part of the ship. And hydraulic fluid and seawater don't make for just real good traction if you're walking around up there. So sailing was postponed for a day while a subtender that was located there at Rota worked throughout the night machining new fittings for the hydraulic system on the Trushcom system. We set sail on the 2nd of June of 1967. Shortly after we passed through the Straits of Gibraltar, we picked up a Soviet destroyer, kept about 1,500 yards off our starboard beam, followed us throughout our transit through the Mediterranean. War was imminent between the Israelis and the United Arab Republic, which at that time consisted of Egypt, some portion of Libya, primarily Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. The Egyptians had the largest number of troops, largest number of tanks, largest number of aircraft. Some years after the 6 days of war, I was contacted by a ground Air Force handler from Maron Air Base in Spain. He told me that prior to the 6 days of war, the United States sent 4 Phantom jets to Maron Air Base in Spain. These were photo reconnaissance planes, the most technically advanced in the world at the time. All of the markings were obliterated on the planes. The pilots were given neutral uniforms, neutral identification, and flew to the Middle East. When war broke out between the Israelis and the United Arab Republic, they had pictures of every aircraft, every artillery piece, and all the troops that were massed on the grounds, courtesy of the Johnson administration. Now, I should say about the troops from Egypt, they were in defensive positions. They were not an offense to the Israelis. Their tanks were all dug in defensive positions. They were not an offense to the Israelis. We had a message come across the ship on June the 5th that hostilities had been initiated by the Israelis. And within a matter of just minutes of time, the Egyptian Air Air Force was destroyed. Liberty arrived on the scene on June the 6th. We began operation almost immediately. My instructions, I was a voice intercept section supervisor. I had 3 sailors and 2 Marines that worked underneath me, and a civilian advisor. The 2 Marines were both Arabic linguists. The civilian, Alan Blue, who was actually killed during the torpedo attack on our ship, was an Arabic linguist. The 3 Navy gentlemen that worked for me were a combination of Portuguese, Spanish, and French linguists. We were given instruction that we were not to copy any Israeli targets. If we picked up a target, and that radio target was identified as an Israeli target, we were to make a notation of it, the time of the intercept, the frequency of the intercept, and drop it. We were not targeted against Israelis. And at this point in my presentation, I would like to make sure that you know exactly where I stand. I want nothing that I say here this evening to be either misconstrued or mistaken as being either anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. My argument, the argument of my fellow survivors, is not against Jewish people. It is against the government of Israel, who perpetrated an act of war on a United States vessel in international waters, clearly marked, and by our own government, the United States government, for accepting the Israeli excuse that it was a case of mistaken identity and perpetrating that lie to the American people. My argument is not against Jewish people. Please don't misconstrue anything I say as being either anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. On the morning of June the 8th, 1967, we were 13 and a half miles off the Sinai Peninsula, a little town called El Arish. The Israelis had just captured an entire Egyptian brigade, somewhere in excess of 850 troops. Literally, they had surrendered. They were starving, not being fed properly. The Israelis, there was a tacit agreement between the Israeli government and the United States government not to take the Golan Heights, which at that time was controlled by Syria. Syria was being supplied by the Soviet Union. There were Soviet advisors with Soviet troops there on Golan Heights. And then we have a gentleman, Fadi, who was at the back, whose uncle was an officer in the Syrian army at that time. So we'll bear out what I have to say about the conflict there on the Syrian Heights. The Israelis from time to time would provoke the Syrians. They would run trucks right up to the Golan Heights, trucks that had weapons aboard them, and the Syrians would bring out their artillery, pound them with fire. Sometimes for any reason or no reason, the Syrians would trot out their artillery and their mortar rounds and peck at the Israeli kibbutzes. So that was a major priority of the Israelis during the 6 Days War, was to take the Golan Heights. I found out many years later that the Israelis had gotten hold of the Syrian general, had paid him a handsome bribe to pull his troops back away from the Golan Heights. The plan was to attack the Golan Heights on June the 8th. But here's this United States Navy communications intercept vessel sitting off the Sinai Peninsula. The troops that were guarding those 850 or so Egyptian troops were needed for the attack on Golan Heights. On the morning of June the 8th, the Israelis forced those captured Egyptian troops to dig their own graves, then brutally murdered them all. Many of them had their hands tied behind their backs with barbed wire. But folks, this is a very serious violation of international law. And I can understand the reason why the Israelis did what they did, but that's no excuse for their violation. The troops that were guarding those Egyptian prisoners of war were needed for the attack on Golan Heights. There was a tacit agreement between the Johnson administration and the Israeli government not to attack Golan because of the Soviet troops that were there. Intervention could possibly lead to deaths of Soviet troops and lead to an intervention which could possibly have sparked World War III, a big-time shooting war. Early in the morning of June the 8th, the Israelis sent several aircraft to circle the Liberty, took pictures of us on 8 different occasions throughout the morning of June the 8th. The pilots got close enough that we could see their faces. Troops that were off duty up on the deck, a lot of them were sunning themselves. Incidentally, that's something that Egyptians would never do. I have a report that was taken from an Israeli pilot. He says in his report that he had spotted both white and black men on the decks. So he knew that it could not be an Egyptian ship, it had to be an American ship. At 1400 hours, 2 o'clock in the afternoon of June the 8th, suddenly there was a series of loud explosions topside. I dropped what I was doing and ran for my GQ station, which was below decks in the operation spaces where we process our transcripts of both manual Morse intercepts and voice intercepts. I remember our senior enlisted man from our division, his name was Nell Smith, says, well, I guess we better start emergency destruction. There's something about the sound of explosions against steel, especially when it's in water. The sound resonates very rapidly in water, especially in warm water as the Mediterranean was. There were 821 large caliber strikes from aircraft on our ship. Later, when torpedo boats attacked us, there were 3,100 machine gun strikes on the USS Liberty. The Israelis use a 20 millimeter shell in their machine guns aboard ship. That is about 2.5 times the size of our standard United States 50 caliber Browning. The projectile is the size of a cigar. There were 3,100 of those strikes. The Israelis claimed they didn't see a flag. They shot down 2 flags and we ran up 3. Our signalman by the name of Joe Nevers finally ran up the largest flag which you have aboard ship. That flag measured 9 feet by 13 feet. It's huge. The lanyard which our normal ensign was flying from was shot away, and the larger flag was run up on a signal halyard. The side of the front of the ship is painted with huge letters GTR5. That stands for General Technical Research. She was the 5th ship of her class. General Technical Research means that she's a non-combatant. By international law, you do not shoot at non-combatant vessels. The Israelis claim they mistook her for El Qasir. El Qasir was an Egyptian ship, a World War I horse carrier. She had not been to sea for 20 years, was totally unseaworthy, and was waiting to be cut up for scrap. The Israelis claimed that they were being shelled from the sea, and the only ship out there was our ship, therefore it had to be a ship of war, therefore they attacked her. Well, there's a couple of problems with that story. Number one is the GTR, non-combatant. Every combatant vessel at sea is required by law to carry a copy of Jane's All the World's Fighting Ships aboard her. Inside that manual is a picture of the USS Liberty. Her only armament was 4 50 caliber machine guns, All of the gunners for those machine guns were killed in the first air raid. The front part of the ship, there was a steel shield, round steel shield that went around the gun tubs on the forecastle, the front part of the ship, which was designed to keep the gunners from falling overboard in case there was a rough sea while they were manning their guns. Rockets from the Israelis struck that shield, exploded, and then struck those gunners. The next morning, the entire front part of the ship was running red with blood. There was a gentleman by the name of John Conroy that was sent over the next day after the attack. John Conroy was a yeoman aboard the USS Davis, the first friendly faces that we saw 19 hours after we were attacked. John Conroy had had breakfast that morning. He was climbing a sea ladder which had been thrown over the side of the ship. When he got to the top of that sea ladder, he was right next to that gun tub. And all of that blood and gore from those dead sailors was staring him in the face. He was so shocked, he almost fell over backwards into the sea. Then for the next 32 hours did nothing but type up casualty reports from the men from the USS Liberty. The Israelis claim they didn't know what GTR meant. That falls apart when the requirement for a copy of Jane's All the World Ships is aboard any attacking vessels. They claim they couldn't see the flag because of the smoke. Well, there wasn't any smoke until the Israelis dropped napalm all over us and set some raging fires. They were using unmarked aircraft. That's a violation of international law. They were machine gunning our lifeboats, our life rafts, what few of them were left after all the ones topside had been destroyed by Israeli rocket fire and napalm. We had 3 inflatable life rafts that were left. I was severely wounded by the torpedo explosion aboard her. There's some copies of the picture were taken of me the next morning over here. You're welcome to them. I was waiting in the radio room to be medevaced, and I saw sailors carrying 3 inflatable life rafts through the radio room. All of our transmitting antennas had been destroyed. The Israelis were using heat-seeking missiles, and they immediately destroyed all of our transmitting antennas. We had one whip antenna that was located at the after part of the ship, which had not been in use and was not affected by the fire. But there was no cable going back there to it. We had a young radioman by the name of Terry Halbardier, incidentally was not awarded his Purple Heart and Silver Star until 2009. Terry Halbardier got a roll of coaxial cable, ran it from our transmitting radio out through the top part of the ship to that whip antenna located at the back part of the ship. He took a lot of shrapnel on his arms, bloody wounds, nothing terribly serious, but bloody wounds. While I was lying there on the deck in the radio room, one of the radiomen figured out that the Israelis could not jam our distress frequencies. That also, by the way, is a violation of international law. While they were shooting rockets at us, because the jamming of our distress frequencies would screw up the flight of the rockets they were shooting at us. During that period of time, while rockets were being fired, we got that one transmitting antenna to operate. And this mayday went out. Firefox, Firefox. This is Rockstar. Under attack by unidentified surface and naval air units. Require immediate assistance. As soon as that mayday was acknowledged, the shooting stopped. That was the point in time where I saw the sailors carrying those inflatable life rafts through, put them over the side. They were attached to the side of the ship by lanyards. I heard a revving of engines and more machine gun fire. One of those sailors came back through the radio room and said, I don't know what we're going to do now. The Israeli mortar torpedo boats had opened fire on those life rafts, severed the line of one of them, came in close, picked up that life raft, and carried it eventually back to Israel. The torpedo boat that fired the fatal torpedo that struck us was operated by the son of the Israeli Admiral. There's a DVD over here that was produced by BBC television called Dead in the Water. We have copies of that available for sale, $10 a piece. This video was shown several times in years past on the History Channel and on what was then called the Military Channel. Changed the name now to American Heroes Channel. But anyway, we had a wealthy gentleman that bought the rights to the movie Dead in the Water and gave it to our Liberty Veterans Association so that we could sell that for the price that we do. In that video is an interview with the Israeli Admiral whose son fired the fatal torpedo. And he claims in that video, well, the ships are similar. I suppose you could claim that. They were both ships. I should point out to you that Egyptian ships are painted gray, or painted black, with hull markings in gray. Hull markings are the license plates of ships at sea. You don't shoot at them without knowing what your target is. Egyptian ships were painted black with their hull markings in Arabic script. American ships are painted gray with hull markings highlighted in bright flight and silhouette in English lettering. Now, don't tell me that the Israelis did not know the difference between English lettering and Arabic script. Every road sign in Israel is printed in English, Hebrew, and Arabic script. Well, I suppose you could claim the pilots were colorblind because they couldn't tell the difference between gray and black. Had they been shooting at the El Qasir, as Israelis claimed they were, the torpedoes would have passed harmlessly underneath her. Torpedoes have to be set for a running depth to strike their target in a vital location. The draft is considerably different between the USS Liberty and the Egyptian ship El Qasir. She was a very shallow drafted ship. Had the Israelis actually been shooting at El Qasir as they claim, the torpedoes would have passed harmlessly underneath her. I was medevac the next morning to the carrier USS America, along with David Lewis, who was our senior intelligence officer aboard the ship. At the time we called a research officer. We couldn't use that word intelligence back in those days. Anyway, Mr. Lewis was in conversation with me about the ditching bags when the torpedo struck. I was facing the torpedo and the glasses I was wearing saved my eyes. Mr. Lewis was standing perpendicular to the torpedo explosion, and debris from the explosion were underneath his glasses and sealed his eyes shut. He was fairly seriously wounded and he was wrapped up from head to toe in bandaging. When he was winched aboard the rescue helicopter the next morning, he was placed on a litter aboard the helicopter, and the corpsman that was attending him couldn't tell which end was up and which end was down, and sat upon his head. And Commander Lewis said at the time this was the most ignominious thing he had ever thought possible. That here he was, survive a torpedo explosion from less than 10 feet away, and then suffocate to death from a corpsman sitting on his face. A few days later, I happened to be passing by the optical shop aboard the USS America, and I looked inside, and Commander Lewis was standing there, and he was reading an eye chart. I stood there patiently until the corpsman finished with him. He turned around and looked at me, grabbed my hand and said, "Sarge, it's so good to see you." Well, yeah, he thought he was blind and now he can see. Admiral Geis, who was the commander of Task Force 6, which included the two USS carriers, the USS America and the USS Saratoga, and the guided missile cruiser, the USS Little Rock. Admiral Geist called Mr. Lewis to his stateroom and stated that he had ordered aircraft launched to come to our aid as soon as the Mayday was received and acknowledged, and the proper coding was acknowledged by the recipients. He had ordered them launched. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had come on the circuit and ordered those aircraft recovered. Both the Saratoga and the USS America had launched aircraft to come to our aid. Now, the planes that were ready on the USS Saratoga had some atomic weapons aboard. Captain Joseph Tully, who was a skipper of the USS Saratoga, ordered those planes recovered, figured that he had been ordered to recover them as a result of those nuclear weapons aboard them, ordered the nuclear weapons removed, rearmed and refueled with conventional weapons, relaunched, and again notified his superiors. Admiral Geist again notified Washington. And again, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara came on the circuit and ordered them recovered. Admiral Geist was livid. So we have an American ship under attack. I want to hear that from higher authority. Secretary McNamara said, here's the president. Lyndon Johnson came on the air and stated, I will not have my allies embarrassed. I don't care if the ship sinks. I will not have my allies embarrassed. Now here's a notable point, folks. We did not know who was shooting at us. The Israelis were using unmarked aircraft. How did President Lyndon Johnson know that his allies were attacking us? America's entire nuclear force was at full alert the morning of June the 8th before we were attacked. We think there's a very good possibility that Lyndon Johnson was preparing to strike a nuclear force against Egypt the morning of June the 8th. He did not like President Nasser of Egypt. He hated him. He just wanted an excuse to strike. We think there's a good possibility that we were set up by our own government as a sacrificial lamb. In the John F. Kennedy administration, if you look at the documents of the Kennedy administration, there is recorded a conversation in the White House between General Curtis LeMay, who at the time was Commanding General of the Strategic Air Command, and General David M. Shoup, who was Commandant of the United States Marine Corps at the time. General Shoup was recipient of the Medal of Honor, World War II in the Pacific Theater. In that conversation, Curtis LeMay stated that what we needed was to set up an American ship as a target, as an excuse for warfare between the Soviet Union. And it's my understanding that one of the Liberty's sister ships, USS Oxford, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, was supposed to have been that sacrificial lamb. The skipper of the USS Oxford got wind of it and didn't go where he was supposed to go, and the entire false program fell through. But we think there's a very good possibility that there was collusion between the Israeli government and the Johnson administration to strike us as an excuse to begin involvement with the United States in the 6 Days War. I probably should have mentioned the reason that I was placed aboard the Liberty was I was a Russian linguist at the time. There was a squadron of Tu-95s, Soviet long-range bomber aircraft, that was stationed at Alexandria, Egypt. The Russians had told the world that those planes had been given to the Egyptians, but nothing could be further from the truth. The crews were entirely Russian crews. The grounds crews, the groundskeepers, and guards were all Russian guards that were wearing United Arab Republic uniforms. They wouldn't let any of the Egyptian troops anywhere near those planes. They would circle the U.S. Sixth Fleet and any other U.S. vessels that were at sea, conduct high-flying intelligence operations against us, then return to the base. While they were at the base at Alexandria, they would conduct their voice communications in Arabic. When they got airborne and over the Mediterranean international waters, they would change frequencies and switch to Russian language. It's ironic that I had the midwatch the morning of June the 8th from 2300 hours June the 7th until 0700 hours the morning of June the 8th. My relief was a gentleman by the name of Jim Lupton, who was also a Russian linguist. We had finished putting all of our classified material in ditching bags in our processing spaces. And Jim Lupton came rushing into the room that I was in, and he said, "Sarge, I got him. I said, "You got who, Jim?" "The Ruskies." I said, "You're kidding me." He said, "No, man, plain language Russian." He still had his canes, his headphones, hanging around his neck, went running back in there. The division officer, Lieutenant Maury Bennett, stuck his head in the door and said, "Sergeant Lockwood, would you come here a minute, please?" Called me out in the passageway and had just started to engage me in a conversation with Commander Lewis about these ditching bags when there was a blinding flash and horrible noise, and that was the torpedo explosion. The Israelis did several violations of international law that day that I'd like to make clear. They were using unmarked aircraft, which is a violation of international law. They were jamming our distress frequencies, which is a violation of international law. They machine gunned our life rafts, which is a violation of international law. And incidentally, that testimony in the KID report card was expunged. That does not appear in the KID report. Now, I'd like to, just yesterday, I received a thick dossier from a gentleman by the name of Pete McCloskey. Pete McCloskey was for several years a United States Republican congressman from California. He was an officer in the United States Marine Corps, Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, Chosin Reservoir. He was awarded our nation's second highest award, the Navy Cross, our nation's third highest award, the Silver Star, and 2 Purple Hearts Award for his actions at Chosin Reservoir. He became an attorney, and in the 1980s received a phone call from a distraught lady in New York City. Her boyfriend was in prison, and she feared for his life here in the United States. He had been a pilot in the Israeli Air Force during the 6 Days War. There were 4 Israeli attack planes that attacked the USS Liberty. One of those planes refused to fire. It's an American ship. It's an American ship. Your orders are to shoot it. It's an American ship. And returned to his base, went to his quarters, and was arrested. He eventually came to the United States, got into some serious trouble over a banking violation, very serious federal felony, was sentenced to 5 years in prison in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He was coming close to the end of his 5-year prison term in 1986. Had his girlfriend contact Jim Ennis, who was the electronics officer aboard our ship and wrote that book, which that pretty lady over there with the gray hair, she's my bride of 57 years. contacted Jim Ennis and wanted him to contact a prominent attorney. She feared for her boyfriend's life. Just prior to the end of, he was an ideal prisoner. He had no violations. He was scheduled to be released from prison. Suddenly he was transferred to the federal medical prison in Springfield, Missouri. It's kind of ironic. 1986, I just lived across town from the federal medical prison. He was placed in solitary confinement there. One of his complaints is Jewish. He wants kosher food. There were 10 other prisoners there who were also Jewish. None of them were getting kosher food. So they contacted Pete McCluskey. Pete flew from California to Springfield, Missouri, and interviewed this gentleman in prison there. And I would like to quote to you from Mr. McCluskey's report. He said he was the executive officer on the flight, that they circled over the Liberty several times, that he saw both black and white sailors on the deck, so it had to be an American ship, that there was a small American flag at first, but they ran up a much larger American flag. He reported to his base that the ship was American, but was told to attack anyway. He refused to fire, flew back to his base. He went to his home or apartment, but was subsequently taken into custody, but he mentioned the name Sharon at some time in the discussion. He said he loved his country, Israel, but was afraid to go back. 2 weeks ago, we had a memorial service on June the 8th, 50th anniversary of the attack on our ship at Arlington National Cemetery. No government officials were there officially. No senior military personnel were there officially. But I met a retired United States ambassador by the name of Dick Vietz. He had been U.S. ambassador to Portugal, U.S. ambassador to Jordan, and U.S. ambassador to, I forget the name of the country in South Africa. While he was ambassador to Jordan, he was given a letter from the State Department to read to Ariel Sharon. We have a CIA document. If any of you want to do some research, I would urge you to go to this website, USS Liberty Document Center.org. USS Liberty Document Center.org. There are no opinions on that site. It's nothing but documents. One of those documents was a fairly recent release from the CIA that stated that it was Moshe Dayan that ordered the attack on our ship. Ambassador Vietz was ordered to take this document and read it, or deliver it to Ariel Sharon. He told me that Mr. Sharon lived in a gorgeous setting. His backyard garden was surrounded with beautiful statuary. All of it had been confiscated. Ariel Sharon told him, he said, "Oh, I can't read this with my one eye." I said, "You read it to me." He leaned back in his chair. Ambassador Vietz read the 4-page document. He said a smile flickered across Ariel Sharon's face. And he stated, "We will double-cross that bridge when we get to it." We, the Liberty survivors, got double-crossed by our own government.